The village of Morvay sat nestled between the mist-clad hills of northern Europe, its cobblestone streets winding through clusters of age-old houses, where the past seemed to linger in every creak of wood and whisper of wind. It was a place forgotten by time, where history and superstition wove together like the ivy that clung to the ancient stone walls of the church at the heart of the village. This was the village's most striking feature, its crumbling church, built centuries ago atop a forgotten mass grave. The villagers called it the Petrified Church, not only because of its looming, stone silhouette but because of the legends that clung to it like the morning fog that never quite lifted. At dusk, when the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with shades of violet and gold, strange things began to happen. The air grew colder, a biting chill that seeped into the bones of anyone who dared venture too close to the church. The villagers would huddle in their homes, muttering prayers under their breath, for they knew what would come when the night fell, soft, mournful sighs carried by the wind, as though the very stones of the church were breathing. The bravest would sometimes glimpse shadows moving around the church, figures draped in tattered robes, their faces obscured by time and sorrow. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone knew that the church was haunted, a place where the living should never venture after dark. It was in this village that Elena and Michael, a young couple seeking a fresh start, arrived one chilly autumn evening. Tired of the bustling city life and the constant hum of modernity, they had decided to leave it all behind for the peace and simplicity of the countryside. They rented a quaint cottage on the outskirts of Morvay, just a stone's throw from the church, where the shadows of the past seemed to stretch long across the earth. The locals were friendly enough, but there was a wariness in their eyes when they spoke of the church. "Don't venture there at night," they would say, "and keep your windows shut tight." But to Elena and Michael, these warnings were nothing more than old superstitions, relics of a bygone era that had no place in their modern world. For the first few weeks, the couple was blissfully unaware of the dark history that clung to the church. They spent their days exploring the village, strolling through the narrow streets and visiting the nearby forest. But as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, strange things began to happen. It started with a faint cracking sound, an odd noise that seemed to come from the direction of the church. At first they thought it was the wind, but as time went on, the sound became more distinct, like the groan of old wood splintering or stone beginning to crack. One evening as they sat in their living room by the fire, Elena glanced out of the window and froze. Through the thick mist that rolled in from the hills, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The church's walls, which had once seemed solid and immovable, were now riddled with cracks as though the very stones were coming apart. Later that night they heard the first sigh. It was soft at first, a barely audible exhalation that seemed to drift through the walls of their cottage. Elena held her breath, listening intently. It came again, louder this time, a deep, aching breath, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, as though someone was pacing just outside their door. Michael, ever the skeptic, laughed it off. "It's probably just the wind playing tricks on us," he said, though there was an unease in his voice that he couldn't quite mask. But the strange occurrences only increased. One night, after an especially heavy rain, Elena went to the small mirror in their entryway to adjust her hair. As she looked into the glass, she felt a chill run down her spine. For a brief moment, she swore she saw something in the reflection, an image of a shadowy figure standing behind her, its face obscured by darkness. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her heart raced, but she tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to the stress of settling into a new home. Still, the unease lingered. The next day, Michael found an old journal in the attic, buried beneath dusty boxes and forgotten trinkets. The leather cover was cracked and weathered, its pages yellowed with age. As he flipped through it, he discovered that the journal belonged to a former priest of the church, a man named Father Alaric, who had lived in Morvay centuries ago. The entries were filled with references to strange events at the church, visions of spirits trapped between worlds, restless souls calling out for release. The last few pages were frantic, written in a hurried hand, detailing a ritual the priest had attempted to perform in order to lay the spirits to rest. But the ritual had failed, and Father Alaric's last words were a chilling warning: "The church is a doorway and the dead are not at peace." By then the couple could no longer ignore the truth. The church was more than just a building, it was a gateway to something darker, something ancient. The air around it hummed with a low, unsettling energy, and the once cracked walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. It was as if the church itself was breathing, waiting for something. Elena and Michael had unwittingly moved into the very heart of the village's darkest secret, and now they had to decide. Would they confront the horrors of the past, or would they flee before the shadows consumed them? As night fell once again, they knew one thing for certain. the church was calling and they could no longer ignore its whispers. The wind howled through the trees as night descended upon Morvay, carrying with it a biting chill that seemed to seep into the bones of all who dared remain outside after dusk. Elena and Michael sat in their cottage, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, but the warmth it offered could not dispel the growing unease that had settled over them since their discovery of Father Alaric's journal. The house felt too quiet, too still, as though the walls themselves were listening, waiting. Michael ran his fingers through his hair, his mind racing. The words in the journal, the references to spirits, restless souls, and the ritual that had failed, echoed in his thoughts. He could hardly shake the image of Father Alaric's frantic scrawl. The church is a doorway and the dead are not at peace. Elena was seated across from him, staring at the mirror in the dim light. Her gaze was distant, as though something invisible was drawing her attention. The reflection in the mirror was too still, too perfect, except for one detail. The edges of the glass shimmered faintly, distorting her image. She blinked, and the reflection rippled as if something were shifting behind her. Her pulse quickened and she whipped around to face the room. But nothing was there, nothing except the oppressive silence that filled the cottage, heavy and thick like a suffocating fog. "I don't think we can ignore this anymore," Elena said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "The church, it's more than just a ruin. It's not just haunted. It's a gateway." Michael shook his head as if trying to dispel the fear that clung to him. "But how could it be? We've only just arrived and we haven't even spoken to anyone here who truly knows what happened." Elena's eyes were wide, her expression distant. "I don't think we need to ask any more. I think we already know." She was right. In the short time they had been in Morvay, the town's past had begun to weave its threads around them like a suffocating web, drawing them closer to the dark heart of the church. The size, the shadows, the cracks in the stone, splitting open like the earth itself was waking up. Suddenly there was a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, but it made Elena's blood run cold. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the direction of the church. It was as if something, or someone, was knocking on the church's stone walls. Michael froze, listening. It came again, louder this time, a slow and deliberate sound, like the tapping of fingers against the stone, echoing across the silent village. He glanced at Elena, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Before Michael could respond, the air grew colder, impossibly so, as if something had opened a door to a place where winter never ended. The fire in the hearth flickered and dimmed, casting eerie shadows across the room. And then the sound came, so close now it was as though it was right outside the door. Knock, knock, knock. Elena stood up quickly, her heart hammering in her chest. "We need to go. Now." She was already halfway to the door when Michael grabbed her arm. "Wait, don't go outside. We don't know what's out there." But Elena's eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the cottage window. The knocking continued, relentless and unyielding. "Please, Michael," she begged, her voice trembling. "We have to see what it is. We can't just keep hiding." With a hesitant nod, Michael let go of her arm, and together they stepped outside into the cold, the darkness pressing in around them like a living thing. The village was eerily silent, save for the faint sound of the tapping from the church. The church loomed in front of them, its silhouette barely visible in the mist that had rolled in, thick as a blanket. The bell tower stood like a crooked finger pointing toward the heavens, and the faint light from their cottage barely touched its stone walls. But it wasn't the sight of the church that made Elena's breath catch in her throat, it was the air around it. The oppressive, suffocating feeling that clung to the atmosphere, making the very ground feel wrong beneath her feet. Suddenly the tapping stopped. For a moment, everything was still. But then a figure appeared in the mist, moving slowly toward them. A tall, cloaked figure, its face hidden beneath the folds of a tattered hood. Michael's heart raced, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. Elena stepped forward, her breath coming in quick gasps. The figure didn't seem to notice them at first, but as it drew nearer, the shadows around it seemed to shift and twist, as though they were alive, crawling toward them. The figure stopped just a few feet from them, and for a long, agonizing moment, there was silence. Then a voice broke the stillness, a whisper barely audible like a breath carried on the wind. "Help them." Elena gasped, stepping back, her eyes wide with fear. Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one hand and pointed toward the church. The gesture was slow, deliberate, as though it was guiding them, forcing them to look. Elena and Michael turned, their eyes drawn toward the church. What they saw made their blood run cold. In the fog, the church walls were no longer solid. They were shifting as though something behind them was moving, pressing against the stone. The cracks in the walls had widened, and through them the faintest glow could be seen, a pale, sickly light flickering like a dying candle. "Do you see it?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling. Michael nodded, his throat dry. The glow was not of this world, it was unnatural, a sickly light that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The air around the church crackled, and with it came the faint sound of whispers, low and indistinct, like the voices of the dead speaking from beyond the grave. The figure began to move again, its form dissolving into the mist as quickly as it had appeared. But the words it had spoken still echoed in the air. "Help them." A chill ran down Elena's spine. The figure, whatever it was, had gone, but its message lingered in the air, pressing against them, suffocating them. Michael's hand tightened around hers, his grip firm, but it did nothing to quell the terror that had taken root in their hearts. The church was no longer just a ruin. It was alive, alive with the voices of the dead waiting to be freed. And they were the ones who had to help them. With no words left to speak, they turned toward the church, knowing that the nightmare had only just begun. As they stepped closer, the earth beneath them trembled, and the air grew heavier, suffused with the scent of decay. The church was no longer a mere building, it was a prison, a tomb that had held the spirits of the forgotten for centuries. And now it was calling to them. Help them. Banda Noi. The fog around the church was thickening, curling like smoke as the night deepened, casting the village in a supernatural gloom. The temperature dropped even further, and every breath Elena and Michael took felt sharp and frigid, as if the very air had turned to ice. They could hear the wind howling through the trees, but there was another sound now, faint and distant, like a soft murmur carried on the breeze, voices whispering, too quiet to make out but unmistakable in their presence. "Elena." Michael's voice was hoarse, barely audible, swallowed by the thick mist. "Do you think we should?" But Elena had already taken a step forward, her feet crunching on the frost-covered ground as she approached the church. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mind screamed at her to turn back, but she couldn't. The pull was too strong, too compelling. It was as though the church itself had become a magnet, drawing them closer, and her legs moved without her permission, each step closer to the crumbling building. She glanced back at Michael, who hesitated for a moment before following her, his face pale in the dim light. The closer they came to the church, the stronger the oppressive feeling became. It was suffocating, as though the very weight of history, of centuries of suffering, had pressed down upon them and they could hardly breathe. When they reached the church's iron gate, they stopped. It stood slightly ajar, its rusted hinges groaning with the wind. The smell of damp stone and earth filled their noses, and there was a metallic tang in the air, something like blood but not quite. Elena shivered involuntarily and pushed the gate open, the creaking sound echoing in the silence. The church loomed before them, ancient and decayed, its once majestic stone walls now cracked and eroded by time. The bell tower was a broken sentinel, its once proud structure now leaning to one side, as if ready to collapse into the earth. But what caught their attention were the cracks in the stone, jagged and wide, spreading across the walls like veins of a dying creature. As they stepped inside, the air felt denser, colder. It was as if the very space was filled with a heavy presence, something watching them, something ancient. The faint glow that had been visible through the cracks in the walls was now gone, replaced by an eerie darkness. The church was silent except for the soft echo of their footsteps, but the whispers, the voices, still lingered, barely perceptible but always present, brushing against their ears. They made their way down the center aisle, the wooden pews long abandoned and rotting with age. The stained glass windows that lined the walls were cracked and shattered, their colorful images faded beyond recognition, casting strange, distorted shadows on the stone floor. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and every movement seemed to stir the past, bringing with it the memories of those who had once filled this place, those who had lived and died in its shadow. At the altar, the cracks in the walls were widest, and the glow from earlier seemed to pulse from behind the stone, faint but growing. It was as if something was trapped behind the walls, something trying to break free. The voices, too, grew louder, clearer, no longer whispers but faint cries of pain and despair. "Do you hear that?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling. Michael nodded, his face drawn tight in fear. "It sounds like people screaming." Elena's gaze moved to the altar, her eyes widening as she saw something. A shadow moving, shifting across the stone, indistinct yet unmistakable. A figure. A silhouette. A man? A woman? It was hard to tell, the shape barely holding together as if it were made of smoke. And then it spoke. "Help me." The voice was weak, strained, but filled with such unbearable sadness that it felt like a physical blow to their chests. Elena took a step forward, her breath catching in her throat. The figure in front of the altar flickered again, and this time, its form solidified just enough to reveal the face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare through them into them. "Please," the figure whispered. "I cannot rest." Before Elena or Michael could react, the ground beneath them trembled, a low, grating sound filling the air, as though something was shifting beneath the earth. The walls of the church groaned, and the very foundation seemed to crack, as though the church was waking from a long slumber. The shadows in the corners of the church grew darker, and the whispers escalated into desperate cries, pleas for mercy, for release, for forgiveness. "Who are you?" Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure's mouth moved, but it was as if the words were trapped inside its throat. It raised a skeletal hand, pointing toward the cracked stone behind the altar. "Free them," it gasped. "Free us." Without thinking, Elena reached toward the altar, her fingers brushing the cold, jagged edges of the stone. As her hand made contact, the air around them seemed to snap, and a cold gust of wind tore through the church, extinguishing the faint light from the cracks in the walls. The ground shook violently, and the cries grew louder, now a cacophony of tortured voices screaming for release. Suddenly, the stone at the altar began to crack, a deep rumbling sound filling the church. The figure's face twisted in agony as the cracks widened, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over Elena and Michael, flooding their senses with an almost suffocating force. "We have to leave," Michael shouted, pulling Elena back. But Elena couldn't move. She was transfixed, her eyes locked on the altar as the stone split open, revealing what lay beyond, nothing but blackness, an endless void stretching far into the depths of the earth. The air around them grew thick, suffocating, and the oppressive presence that had haunted the church seemed to rise from the depths, pressing in on all sides. And then, from the blackness, a voice spoke, a voice older than time itself, a voice that seemed to come from the earth, from the stone, from the very fabric of reality. "Help me. Help us." Elena stumbled back, her legs weak beneath her, but the force of the presence held her in place. The figure at the altar collapsed, its form disintegrating into dust, leaving only a whisper in the air. The ground trembled once more, and the very walls of the church seemed to begin to shift, the cracks spreading like the fingers of a monstrous hand reaching for them. It was as if the church itself were alive, waking after centuries of slumber, and it was hungry. "Help them," the voice demanded, louder now, more insistent. Michael reached for Elena's hand, his eyes wide with terror. "We have to go. Now." But Elena's gaze was fixed on the altar, on the now cracked stone that had revealed the abyss beneath. She knew deep down that they couldn't leave, couldn't run. The voices, the cries, the souls trapped here, they were reaching for them, and the only way out was through. There was no escape. Not until they freed what had been buried for so long. The darkness behind the altar began to swirl, taking shape, growing stronger, and the air turned to ice. The church was no longer just a place of worship, it was a prison, a gateway to something far worse, far older, and they had opened it. "We have to help them," Elena whispered, her voice shaking with fear and resolve. And as the church rumbled around them, the past and the present began to collide, and Elena and Michael were forced to make a choice, to face the terror buried beneath the stone or become another lost soul trapped within its walls forever. The voices were getting louder, the whispers turning to screams. They could no longer turn back. The air in the church was heavy with an unbearable pressure, as though the very foundation of the building had become a living thing, straining and groaning under the weight of centuries of suffering. Elena and Michael stood frozen, rooted to the spot by the overwhelming force that surrounded them. The whispers were no longer distant, no longer faint, they had become an all-encompassing roar echoing in their minds, pressing against their skulls with an intensity that made their ears ring. "Help them," the voice rumbled again, but this time it was not one voice. It was a chorus, a multitude of voices rising and falling in a horrific cacophony. The air seemed to crackle with their presence, as if the very atmosphere was thick with their despair, their anger, their hunger for release. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to Elena, his hand gripping hers so tightly that it almost hurt. Her face was pale, her lips parted in shock, her eyes wide as she stared at the gaping wound in the stone behind the altar. "We can't stay here," Michael said, his voice shaking with fear. "We have to get out of here, Elena. We're not equipped for this. This isn't normal. This isn't." But Elena didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the abyss behind the altar, her breath coming in short gasps. The blackness that had poured forth from the cracked stone had deepened, swirling in on itself like a storm, and from within it, figures began to take shape, wraith-like figures, their outlines flickering like shadows in the dim light. "No," Elena whispered, her voice distant as though she were hearing the words from far away. "We can't leave. We can't just turn our backs on this. This is why we came here. To help them. To free them." Michael's hand tightened around hers, panic rising in his chest. "Elena, no. This isn't something we can fix. Look at it, look at what we've done. We've opened a door and now the dead." He stopped, his throat dry, unable to finish his thought. The figures emerging from the darkness were all around them now, their forms twisted and grotesque, their eyes hollow, their mouths stretched in silent screams. But Elena, as though guided by an invisible force, stepped forward, her gaze never leaving the darkness. She whispered something under her breath, the words lost in the roar of the voices, but Michael could see the determination in her eyes, the same fire that had led them here to this forsaken place, and now, it seemed, to the very heart of the horror they had unleashed. "Elena!" Michael cried, pulling at her arm, but she resisted, shaking her head. "We can't leave them, Michael. We have to help them," she said, her voice firm, though it trembled with fear. "They've been waiting for so long. We're the only ones who can give them peace." The swirling darkness before them grew stronger, pulsating with an unnatural force. The figures in the shadows began to move toward them, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. The air grew colder still, and Michael could feel the chill seeping into his bones, turning his very blood to ice. I don't understand," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of screams. "What do you mean help them? What do you want us to do?" Before Elena could answer, one of the figures lunged forward with inhuman speed, its skeletal hands reaching for her. Michael shouted in terror, but Elena didn't flinch. The figure's hand passed right through her, as though she were made of mist. The creature recoiled, its shrill wail echoing in the church, and suddenly, everything went still. The figures around them froze, suspended in the darkness, their faces twisted in eternal torment. "They want us to release them," Elena whispered. Her eyes were wide with realization. "They are trapped between worlds, Michael. They were never meant to be here. We can set them free." Michael's heart raced as he looked around at the gathering shadows, each one more terrifying than the last. His mind screamed to turn away, to flee, but something deeper inside him, the same pull he had felt since entering the village, kept him rooted in place. He didn't understand it, but he knew somehow that they were tied to this place. They couldn't escape it, not until it was done. "They need us to open the gate," Elena continued, her voice distant yet resolute. "The gate behind the altar. The one she faltered, glancing back at the stone. "The one we unwittingly cracked. But the ritual isn't complete. We need to finish what was started. We need to give them release." Michael took a shaky step forward, his body trembling. How do we finish it? What do we have to do?" Elena turned to him, her face pale but determined. "We need to call upon them. To acknowledge their suffering. To make them feel heard. They need to know that we recognize their pain. And then, we have to let them go." The darkness around them seemed to swirl tighter, as if the very walls of the church were pushing inward. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble again, and the whispers, the cries, intensified as if the spirits were growing restless, impatient for release. Elena closed her eyes, her hands trembling as she raised them toward the stone behind the altar. Michael watched in awe, his breath caught in his throat. He had never seen her like this, so calm, so sure, as if the terror that had consumed him had no hold over her. "Spirits of the lost," she began, her voice rising above the chaos. "I hear you. I feel your pain. I know your suffering. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. Your voices, your cries, they have reached me. And now I offer you peace. I offer you the release you have longed for. Your suffering ends here. Go into the light, into the eternal rest you have been denied." As she spoke, the darkness around them seemed to react, swirling in on itself, the figures flickering as if they were struggling to break free from the confines of the church. The air grew thick with energy, a palpable force that seemed to bend reality itself. The ground shook violently, and the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. Then all at once the church was silent. The figures in the shadows collapsed to the ground, their forms disintegrating into dust, and the swirling darkness behind the altar began to recede. The oppressive weight in the air lightened, and for the first time, Elena and Michael could breathe freely. The oppressive energy that had filled the church seemed to lift, leaving only an eerie stillness in its wake. But the church had changed. The cracks in the stone were gone, sealed as though they had never been. The glow from behind the altar had faded, and the blackness that had once consumed everything had dissolved into nothing. They had done it. They had freed the souls trapped in the church. But as Elena and Michael stood there, gasping for breath, a final haunting whisper filled the air, one last cry from the depths of the void. "Thank you." And then, as if the church had never been anything but a ruin, the air grew still. The church was silent. The spirits were gone. But the weight of their release hung in the air, a reminder that some doors once opened could never be closed. And as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, Elena and Michael knew that they had changed. They were no longer just visitors to this place, they were now a part of its history. And the church, though silent, would never forget. Neither would they. The dawn light crept slowly across the sky, casting a pale golden hue over the village. The air felt cleaner, lighter, as though a storm had passed and left only a lingering trace of its presence. Elena and Michael stood together outside the church, gazing up at its weathered stone facade. The building, though still ancient, no longer held the oppressive, suffocating aura it once had. The cracks had sealed, the darkness had lifted, and the whispers of the lost souls had faded into the wind. Yet, despite the stillness, something inside both of them felt irrevocably changed. The weight of what they had witnessed, the release of the trapped spirits, the final moment of peace that had washed over the church, hung in the air between them. There was no celebration, no relief, just a quiet understanding that something had been altered, something profound and eternal. Michael broke the silence first, his voice strained but filled with wonder. Did we really do it? I can't believe it, Elena. I thought we were going to die in there. I thought we had unleashed something that we couldn't control." Elena's gaze remained fixed on the church, her expression unreadable. She nodded, but her eyes seemed distant, as though she were staring through the walls of the church into something far beyond. "We did," she said quietly. "We freed them. But in doing so we've changed something. The church, it's not the same anymore. I can feel it." Michael glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Elena whispered. "But I can feel it deep inside. There's something still here. Not the spirits, not the darkness, but something else." Her words hung in the air, an unsettling thought that neither of them could fully grasp. They had come to the church seeking answers, seeking a way to help the souls trapped between worlds. But in doing so, they had uncovered something much older, something darker than either of them had ever imagined. The villagers had gathered outside, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the church, some of them casting wary glances toward Elena and Michael. They were no longer the outsiders, no longer the strangers who had stumbled into a cursed place. They were now part of the story, part of the church's long-forgotten history. An elderly man, his face lined with years of sorrow, approached them slowly. His hands shook slightly as he spoke. "You've done it, haven't you?" His voice was rough, like a croak from the depths of his throat. "You freed them." Elena nodded. "Yes, we did. They're at peace now." The man's eyes filled with tears, but his face remained expressionless. He looked past them at the church. "The church, it was never meant to be opened. Not like this. You've broken something that should have stayed closed." Michael stepped forward, his concern rising. "What do you mean?" "We freed the spirits. They're gone now." The man shook his head, his eyes wild with an unknown fear. "You think you've freed them? You've only changed the balance. You don't understand. The church was a prison, yes, but it was also a seal. A barrier. And now that it's broken, something else will come." Elena and Michael exchanged a confused glance. "What do you mean?" Elena asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man's eyes darkened, and he looked over his shoulder as though searching for something in the distance. The church was built on an ancient burial ground. Beneath it, far beneath, there was something older than the spirits, something older than even the dead. A force that existed before time. And that was what kept it all contained. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of force? What are you talking about?" The old man's voice dropped to a near hiss. "The thing that has no name. The thing that does not die. You've opened a door, young ones, and now you've unleashed what was never meant to be freed. It's still here, watching." Elena's hand gripped Michael's arm tightly. "What are we supposed to do? How do we stop it?" The man stepped back, his face contorted with an emotion they couldn't place. "It's too late now. You've done what you could. The balance is gone. The only thing left is to wait." Elena's heart hammered in her chest and her mind raced. What had they really released? The spirits they had freed, were they the true prisoners? Or had they merely been the keepers of something darker, something far more terrifying? Before either of them could ask another question, the ground beneath them trembled. It was subtle at first, just a faint vibration, but then it grew stronger, a deep rumble that shook the earth and sent dust falling from the roof of the church. The villagers scattered, panic spreading like wildfire through the crowd. "What's happening?" Michael shouted over the growing roar. Elena's eyes shot to the church, her blood running cold. The cracks that had sealed so perfectly now began to widen again, slowly, almost deliberately. From within the stone, a faint, low hum began to emanate, a sound so deep it seemed to reverberate through their very bones. It was not the sound of the spirits. It was something else. Something primal. "Elena, we need to leave. Now," Michael urged, grabbing her by the arm. But Elena stood rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the church, unable to tear herself away. She could feel it now, the pull, the force that had been locked away beneath the earth. It was alive. It was awake. And it was calling to her. In the distance, the sound of thunder rumbled, though the sky was clear. And as the sun began to rise higher, its light refracting off the church's stone walls, Elena saw something she hadn't noticed before, something flickering just beneath the surface of the cracks. Shadows. Moving. Twisting. A figure. It was impossibly tall, shrouded in darkness, and its form shimmered like a mirage. It was watching them, its presence an oppressive weight in the air, suffocating and suffused with an ancient power that seemed to stretch beyond time. And then, in the silence that followed, a voice spoke. "Return what you have taken." The words sent a shiver through Elena's spine, a coldness that reached deep into her soul. The figure remained in the shadows, but its gaze was unmistakable, its eyes boring into her very essence. She stepped back, the weight of its presence pressing against her chest. What does it want?" Michael turned to her, his face pale with fear. "We have to go, Elena. This isn't over. It's just begun." But Elena couldn't move. She couldn't look away. The stone was alive again. The gate was open, and the thing that had been imprisoned beneath the church was free. And there was no going back. The figure in the shadows grew clearer, its towering presence radiating an energy so ancient, so unfathomable, that it seemed to warp the very air around it. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to breathe, the weight of its gaze pressing down on her with an unbearable force. Michael's grip on her arm tightened, his voice frantic as he pulled at her. "Elena, we have to get out of here. This isn't what we came for." His words seemed to echo through the air, but the shadows around them swallowed his voice, as if it had never been spoken. But Elena, her gaze locked on the shifting, shadowy form, could not look away. It was as if the very soul of the church was staring back at her, and she could feel its hunger, its thirst for release. It was not the spirits they had freed, but something older, something that had never been meant to be disturbed. The figure's presence was suffocating, and yet there was a strange pull within Elena, a desire to understand, to know what it was that had been locked away for so long. The darkness, the presence, it called to something deep within her, something buried beneath years of quiet, ordinary life. She felt herself drawn to it, as if the church had been waiting for her all along. "Return what you have taken." The voice came again, not as a command but as a plea, urgent, desperate, and filled with an anger that resonated through every fiber of her being. It wasn't just a warning, it was a curse. Michael's voice broke through her trance. "Elena, you have to listen to me. We have to leave now. It's too dangerous." But Elena stood still, her heart pounding faster with each beat. The figure in the shadows seemed to writhe, its form flickering like the dying embers of a fire, and for a moment she thought she saw something beyond it, something in the deep recesses of the church. A faint glow. A presence far darker than anything she had ever imagined. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her body moving on its own. "What are you? What do you want from us?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it felt like the words themselves had shaken the very walls of the church. The figure remained silent, but Elena could feel the air shift, the temperature drop. There was something familiar in its presence, something that tugged at her memory. It wasn't just a force of darkness, it was something personal. It knew her. It had always known her. "You were the key," it whispered, its voice reverberating through her skull. "The moment you arrived, you began to unlock the door. And now you will finish what was started. You will return what was taken, or the world will drown in the darkness you unleashed." Elena's mind spun, confusion and terror battling for control. What had she taken? What had they truly done when they freed the souls? The stone had sealed away the spirits, but beneath it, beneath it lay something more. The church, she realized, had never just been a prison for the souls of the dead. It had been built on an ancient seal, a barrier that kept something far darker at bay, something that had once roamed the earth and had been locked beneath this sacred ground to prevent it from consuming everything. And they, in their desperation to free the trapped spirits, had unwittingly shattered that seal. Return what you have taken. It wasn't a choice. The figure's form shimmered and split, casting long, twisted shadows across the altar. It reached out, its hand stretching toward her, and Elena felt herself drawn forward by an invisible force. She fought against it, but the pull was too strong, too relentless. In that moment, a flash of memory hit her. She had seen this before. Not in the church, not in the village, but somewhere deeper, deeper within her. She had felt this darkness before long ago, and she had feared it, because it was a part of her. The presence was not something separate from her. It was bound to her, a dark seed planted deep within her soul, waiting to be awakened. No, Elena gasped, her voice trembling. I can't. She tried to pull back, but the shadows wrapped around her like chains, dragging her toward the altar. Michael screamed her name, but his voice was drowned out by the growing roar of the darkness. But just as the figure's hand reached out to claim her, the ground beneath them rumbled again, this time with an explosive force that shook the entire church. The walls cracked wider, and the once dormant seal began to pulse with a new intensity, as if it was waking from a long slumber. Michael, in a desperate surge of adrenaline, lunged forward, pushing Elena away from the altar. He stumbled, falling to his knees, but as he reached out to her, something shifted within the church. The walls groaned and the darkness retreated, pulling back from them. Elena gasped, her body no longer frozen by the presence, and she staggered back, her hand gripping Michael's as they both scrambled to their feet. The figure in the shadows faltered, its form flickering violently. Its voice, once commanding, now sounded desperate, strained. "You cannot stop what is already set in motion," it hissed. "The seal will be broken. The world will be consumed. You have no choice. You will return what you have taken." But Elena and Michael, trembling but resolute, stood their ground. The church shook once more, but this time, it was not the tremor of an awakening evil. It was the sound of the earth itself reclaiming its own. The shadows began to dissipate, the darkness receding into the cracks, and with it, the figure shrank into nothingness. The glow from the altar faded, and the church, once a place of terror, now stood silent, its oppressive presence gone. The voices, the whispers, the fear, they were gone. But the damage had been done. As the sun rose higher, its light spilling over the ruined stone walls, Elena and Michael looked around them. The church was no longer a prison, no longer a gateway. It had returned to what it had always been, a silent monument to the forgotten, to the darkness that once lay beneath. "Is it over?" Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. Elena nodded, though the weight of what had happened would never leave them. "Yes, it's over. But we can never forget." They turned away, walking hand in hand into the light of the rising sun. The village was quiet, peaceful. But in the back of their minds, they both knew that the darkness would always linger, a part of the world that could never truly be erased. The church had been sealed once more, but the price had been paid. This story, though chilling and filled with darkness, is entirely a work of fiction.